Wesley Sutter didn't mean to crash the bonfire. He was just looking for a quiet place to clear his head after walking out of a charity gala where everyone wanted a piece of his bank account. He kicked off his shoes and let the wet sand sink beneath his toes as he walked toward the flickering orange light in the distance. The beach was supposed to be empty this time of night, but laughter and the smell of burnt marshmallows told him otherwise. He could have turned around. Should have. But he didn't. Instead, he kept walking toward the sound of carefree voices and crackling flames, drawn like someone who hadn't felt real in weeks. "Hey, you lost or just crashing our party?" A voice called out sharp, teasing, and definitely female. Wesley looked up and saw her. She stood with one hand on her hip, the firelight catching on her long dark curls and making her eyes look almost gold. She wore a faded hoodie and cut-off jeans, barefoot like him, but there was something about the way she held herself that made her look like she owned the entire beach. "I guess I'm crashing," he said, his voice scratchy from the salty air. "Didn't expect anyone to be here," she arched a brow. "We're locals. We always take over this spot after the summer tourists leave. You're not from around here, are you?" "Not exactly," he said, offering the smallest smile. "Mind if I join?" She hesitated for a second, then nodded toward the circle. "As long as you're not a serial killer." Wesley let out a breath. "Not today." She laughed and turned back toward the group. "I'm Tessa Traylor, by the way. Wes." He didn't offer his last name. He never did when he wanted to be just a guy. Tessa led him to the fire and introduced him to the group, most of whom looked about her age, mid-20s, relaxed, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. No one asked questions. No one recognized him. It was the first time in months he felt invisible in the best way. "Grab a stick," Tessa said, handing him a marshmallow. "We don't let anyone sit out, so this is mandatory." "Absolutely." He sat beside her, pushing the marshmallow into the flames just like she did. The wind caught her hair and blew it against his cheek. He didn't move. "So what brings you to our little beach?" she asked, eyes flicking to him. "Needed air," he said. "Somewhere quiet." She nodded like she understood. "Let me guess. You were at one of those stuffy resort parties up the coast." He turned, surprised. "How'd you know? You smell like cologne and disappointment." He laughed, actually laughed, and it felt good. "Guilty? Yeah, those things are the worst. Everyone acting like they care about saving whales or trees or whatever, but only if someone's watching." He tilted his head at her. "You've gone. Once. Dated a guy who thought rubbing elbows with millionaires would make him one. And did it. He ended up selling solar panels in Arizona. So, no." They both laughed again, and he liked the way she looked at him, like she wasn't trying to guess his net worth or get something out of him. Like she was just curious. He stayed until the group started thinning out, people heading back to their cars or walking home barefoot through the dunes. Tessa didn't move. "You sticking around?" he asked her. She nodded. "I always do. I like the quiet after everyone leaves." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire dying down, the waves soft in the background. "You've got good taste in escapes," he said. She glanced at him. "You don't talk like you're from here." "I'm not." "So where are you from, Wes?" He hesitated, then said, "New York." She whistled. "Big city guy." "I'm taking a break." "From what?" He looked at her, and something about her face made him want to tell the truth. "Everything." She didn't push, just looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and leaned back on her elbows. "You ever make s'mores in silence before?" she said. "No." "Well, you're about to. It's kind of my thing." They made s'mores without saying another word. It was ridiculous and somehow perfect. When he finally stood to leave, she looked up at him. "You gonna crash again tomorrow?" He blinked. "You'd let me," she shrugged. "I don't invite just anyone to my fire." He smiled. "Then I guess I'll be back." He walked away barefoot, sand cold beneath his feet, heart weirdly light. He didn't know who the hell Tessa Traylor was, only that she had just made him feel more seen in one night than anyone had in years. And he was already wondering how soon was too soon to see her again. Wesley returned the next night. He told himself it was just to breathe again, to get out of the thick, suffocating fog that had followed him since the board meeting where his father's voice, cold and clipped, had reminded him that legacy came with expectations. But as he parked his rental car farther down the Sandlot Road and followed the soft glow of firelight again, he knew it wasn't just about peace, it was about her. Tessa was already there, sitting cross-legged on a folded blanket, sketching something in a small spiral notebook. Her hair was tied up in a loose knot, and she wore a battered denim jacket covered in tiny patches, stars, waves, a faded rocket ship like a story stitched across her back. "You're late," she said without looking up. "I wasn't aware there was a call time," Wesley replied as he stepped closer. "There is when I'm sharing my firewood," she said, finally lifting her gaze. "You want to be useful. What's the task? Grab that log," she said, gesturing with her pencil toward a small pile behind her. "I'm not burning my hands again." He did as asked, setting it carefully into the pit while she added kindling. She didn't rush. Everything she did had a rhythm to it, unhurried, grounded. He sat beside her once the flames caught. She didn't offer him a marshmallow this time. Instead, she handed him a battered thermos. "Hot cider, but it's not spiked, don't get excited." He took a sip. "Still the best thing I've had all day, long one," he nodded. "Boardroom politics. A man in a bow tie told me I was becoming unpredictable." "Are you?" "I hope so." She laughed once short, amused. "You don't talk like an accountant." "I'm not." "Didn't think so. You've got the posture of someone who signs checks, not files them." He looked at her, really looked. "You always this observant." "I paint people. You have to notice things when you paint. You're an artist." "Try to be. I do murals. Some gallery work when I can afford the canvas. Most of the time I teach kids at the community center how to make a mess and call it genius." He could see it now, the smudges of charcoal still dark under her nails, the faint streak of blue near her elbow. "Ever show your work?" "Not unless I want a panic attack." "I'm not great with attention. Seems like a waste," she shrugged. "Maybe, but art's not just for walls, sometimes it's just for air." He leaned back on his hands. "I grew up in a world where everything had to have a return. If it didn't make money, it wasn't worth anything." She turned to him. "That why you're here, escaping your ROI, something like that." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You ever build sandcastles?" He blinked. "As a kid, sure. Wanna try again?" Now he was laughing. "At night. There's a full moon, the tide's low. Come on, rich boy. Let's see if you've still got imagination in you." They left their shoes beside the fire and walked toward the wet shoreline, the moon casting silver streaks across the water. She dropped to her knees and started carving a moat with her hands. Wesley hesitated, then knelt beside her. "So what are we building?" "A kingdom. But it's under siege." He raised a brow. "By whom?" "Seagulls, the greedy kind." "Of course." For the next half hour they built towers and battlements, she sculpting tiny windows with a stick, he reinforcing the walls with pebbles. It was absurd and childish and completely wonderful. When a wave finally rolled in and collapsed the eastern watchtower, Tessa gasped dramatically. "The Queen's chamber. We lost it." Wesley tossed a shell at the tide. "We'll rebuild. Stronger this time." She looked at him and her smile faded just a little. "You always do that." "What? Try to fix everything?" He shrugged, brushing sand from his hands. "It's easier than watching it fall apart." She was quiet again, then said, "Sometimes things need to fall apart. That's how you find out what's worth keeping." Wesley didn't reply. He wasn't sure he could. He'd spent years keeping everything standing, his company, his image, his father's impossible legacy. The idea of letting any of it collapse didn't terrify him. It tempted him. They walked back to the fire in silence. The group from the previous night hadn't returned. It was just them now, the beach stretching wide and empty under the stars. Tessa packed her notebook away, then looked over at him. "You hungry?" "Always. I make a mean grilled cheese. I'm intrigued. My place is 2 blocks up. Don't get excited, it's nothing fancy." "I'm not looking for fancy." She studied him for a beat, then nodded. "Come on." They walked up the sand path, past wind-battered mailboxes and low stucco homes with porches lit by string lights. Her house was on the corner, small, with crooked shutters and a front yard full of wildflowers. Wesley followed her inside, the air smelling faintly of turpentine and cinnamon. "Shoes off," she said, kicking hers into a woven basket. "And don't touch anything on the easel. That's a commission." He obeyed, wandering toward the open kitchen as she pulled bread from the fridge. "You cook often?" he asked. "Only when I'm procrastinating." "From what?" "Finishing paintings, calling my mom, paying rent." He leaned against the counter. "Sounds familiar." She glanced at him. So what would your world think if they saw you barefoot in a stranger's kitchen, waiting for grilled cheese? They'd assume I'd lost my mind. And have you? He met her eyes. Maybe, but it feels like the first good kind of madness I've had in a long time. She didn't look away. You're not like I expected. What did you expect? Someone who'd lie about who he really was. I'm not lying. No, but you're not telling me everything either. He considered that, then said, would you want me to? Tessa flipped the sandwich, watching the cheese melt. Only if it's real. The room filled with the soft sizzle of butter on the skillet. When they sat down to eat, knees touching under the tiny table, he realized something strange. She didn't ask for anything, not his last name, not his business, not a favor, not a future. She just passed him a napkin and said, don't burn your tongue, that cheese bites back. And he realized he'd never been more tempted to risk it. Wesley showed up the next afternoon. He hadn't planned to. He was supposed to be across town, at a meeting with a real estate developer who wanted him to fund an oceanfront resort, the kind of polished monstrosity that would bulldoze everything that made this place special. But as he sat in the back of his Tesla, watching the waves through tinted glass, he heard Tessa's voice in his head. Sometimes things need to fall apart. He told Roger, his assistant, to cancel the meeting. Now he stood at the open gate of her front yard, eyeing the riot of flowers that seemed to bloom without permission or order. There was a faded wind chime made of forks hanging from the porch beam, and the sound of something playing inside, music, maybe, or a recording. He knocked. The door opened halfway and Tessa appeared, a paintbrush tucked behind one ear, her cheeks streaked with pale lavender. You're either lost or you're braver than most men. I'll take the second one. You didn't text. I don't have your number. She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. So you just showed up. You said your grilled cheese was a form of procrastination. Thought maybe you needed another excuse. She studied him for a long breath, then stepped aside. Come in, but if you step on my drop cloth, I'll make you pay for the canvas. Inside, the space had transformed. The easel had moved to the corner, replaced by a long table covered in glass jars filled with brushes, scraps of fabric, and what looked like dried seaweed. The music he'd heard was a recording of storm sounds, thunder rolling gently beneath the hum of rain. I'm working on a piece, she said. Commission from a couple who wants their honeymoon spot turned into something abstract. They sent me a blurry photo of a cliff and a lot of adjectives. He followed her toward the back room. What kind of adjectives? Eternal, sacred, and like breathing underwater. She gave him a dry look. So naturally, I'm painting a cloud shaped like lungs. He leaned against the doorframe, watching as she dipped a brush into a jar of teal. You always interpret things this literally, only when I'm bored by rich people's metaphors. He laughed, then nodded toward the canvas. Can I see it? Not until it dries. I don't like people watching things half-formed. Fair enough. She set the brush down and wiped her hands on an old towel. So what are you really doing here, Wes? I didn't want to be anywhere else. She didn't respond right away. Then she walked past him and into the kitchen, pulling 2 glasses from the cabinet. You drink iced tea, or are you one of those men who needs everything to be aged in oak? Iced tea's fine. She filled both glasses and handed him one, then gestured toward the small back porch. Come sit. They sat side by side on a bench that looked like it had been rescued from a shipwreck. The yard was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint creak of the neighbor's windmill. You always this impulsive? She asked. No, that's new. She sipped her tea. Let me guess. You usually have your days planned down to the minute, more like the second. And you ditched all that to come here? I didn't ditch it. I just paused it. She looked over at him. That sounds like something people say when they're trying not to admit they're running. Maybe I am running. And what exactly are you running from? He hesitated, then said, a version of myself I don't want to become. Tessa sat back. That's not an answer people usually give. That's because people don't usually ask the kind of questions you do. She crossed one leg over the other, her bare foot brushing against his. So what version are you afraid of? The one who forgets what it's like to sit still. The one who thinks numbers matter more than people. You think you're becoming that, I was, before this week. She looked away toward the battered fence at the edge of the yard. You know, I used to think love was supposed to feel like a hurricane. Loud, messy, unavoidable. Now I think maybe it's more of a tide, quiet, steady, pulling you in before you even notice. He watched her, the curve of her jaw, the way her eyes didn't quite meet his. Are you saying this feels like love? I'm saying it feels like something. He exhaled slowly. I don't know what this is yet, but I know I don't want it to end. She stood then, abruptly, and walked back inside. He followed, unsure if he'd said too much or not enough. When he stepped into the living room, she was rummaging through a tall bookshelf. She pulled something down and handed it to him. It was a photograph. A beach, not unlike the one they'd met on, but this one was empty. The light was strange, almost silver, and the sky looked cracked. My dad took that, she said. Wesley looked at her. He a photographer, he was a fisherman. But he loved the sky, said it was the only thing that never stayed the same. Wesley handed it back carefully. He sounds like someone I would have liked. He died 3 years ago. Boat capsized during a storm. I'm sorry, she nodded once. Me too. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Then she said, I think you should see where I paint when I'm not working for clients. She led him down a narrow hallway to a door at the back of the house. When she opened it, the scent of salt and paint hit him like a wave. Inside was a garage converted into a studio. The walls were covered in canvas, some stretched, some hanging loose. Unlike her commissioned work, these were wild, raw. One looked like a scream caught in color. Another like the shape of a song. These are incredible, he said, genuinely stunned. I don't show them. Why not? They're mine. He turned toward her. You're afraid of what people will think. I'm afraid of what I'll think if they don't feel what I felt when I made them. He stepped closer. They would. I do. She didn't move away. Wes, yeah, don't fall in love with the version of me you think I am. I'm not here to be saved or sculpted into someone who fits better next to a man with a trust fund. He reached up and tucked a curl behind her ear. I'm not falling in love with a version of you. I'm falling in love with the girl who builds sandcastles to defend against imaginary seagulls. Her breath caught, and then she kissed him, not tentative, not polite, but like she didn't want to regret not doing it. He kissed her back. And for the first time in years, Wesley Sutter didn't feel like an escapee from his own life. He felt like he'd finally found the part of it worth returning to. The invitation came 3 days later, slid under Tessa's front door in a thick linen envelope with no return address. It had her name written in dark blue ink, the handwriting neat and deliberate. She opened it with paint-stained fingers, brows lifting as she read aloud. Miss Tessa Traylor, you are cordially invited to the Solstice Gala hosted at Mariners Hall. Formal attire required. A car will arrive at 7. She stared at the bottom. No signature, just a silver seal pressed into the corner. She turned to the open garage where Wesley stood, holding a coffee cup and pretending to study one of her untitled canvases. You don't think this is a little dramatic? She asked, holding up the envelope. He didn't look at her. You said you'd never been to a gala that didn't make you want to light something on fire. I thought I'd try to change that. You're inviting me as your plus one. I'm inviting you as the only person I want next to me when I tell 100 people I don't care what they think. She leaned against the doorframe. You're not going to pretend to be someone else this time. I've done enough pretending for one lifetime. She set the invitation down. So what's the dress code? Emotional armor and open wounds. Close. But I was thinking something that makes you feel like you own the room. The car arrived on time. Not one of his usual town cars, but a sleek vintage convertible with a driver who wore a navy vest and called her ma'am without irony. She wore a fitted black jumpsuit she'd borrowed from her friend Sienna, heels she hadn't touched since her cousin's wedding, and a silver cuff that used to belong to her mother. Wesley met her at the entrance to Mariners Hall, standing just beneath the grand arch, his navy tux sharp and understated. He looked like he belonged in paintings and fortune magazines, but when he saw her, something in his face softened in a way that made her forget how to breathe. You clean up well, she said, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. He offered his arm. You're radiant. I'm merely background. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with hanging glass orbs and violet lighting, the kind that made everyone look like they'd stepped out of a dream. Crystal glasses clinked and low strings played in the distance. Tessa felt the familiar edge of discomfort rise, the tug of being somewhere she didn't quite belong. but Wesley didn't let go of her arm. "Why are we really here?" she asked beneath her breath as they stepped onto the marbled floor. "Because I'm about to dismantle something I spent 10 years building." He guided her toward the center of the hall, where a temporary stage had been erected. A man in a silver suit stepped up to the podium to introduce the evening's honoree, the youngest real estate investor to ever reach a 7-figure portfolio before 30. Wesley didn't move. Tessa narrowed her eyes. "They're talking about you." He nodded once. Then he walked up the steps. The room fell hushed. The man at the podium stepped aside, confused. Wesley took the microphone. He didn't look at the crowd, he looked at her. "Some of you know me. Some of you think you do. I've spent my career building things that looked perfect on paper. That made money. That impressed people who measure worth in square footage and shareholder returns." He paused. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot what it meant to build something that felt like home. I forgot what it meant to listen to silence instead of noise." He scanned the room now, his voice steady. "Last week, I stood on a beach and realized I didn't recognize the man I'd become. And I met someone who didn't care about my name, my money, or the size of my portfolio. She cared if I could roast a marshmallow without setting it on fire." A few polite laughs scattered through the crowd. "She reminded me that life doesn't have to be a transaction. That not every beautiful thing has to be bought, branded, or built into a resort. So I'm pulling out of the Oceanside development project, effective immediately. I won't be turning that coastline into another luxury retreat for people looking to escape the very lives they built." Gasps echoed through the room. Phones lit up in hands. "And if that means losing investors, so be it. I'd rather lose money than lose the only thing I've found worth keeping." He stepped back, handed the microphone to the stunned MC, and walked directly toward her. Tessa stared at him, heart racing. "You meant that?" He stopped inches away, his voice low but sure. "Every word. What happens now, that's up to you." She hesitated. "You're walking away from millions. I'm walking toward something better." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. She blinked. "Are you serious? Open it." Inside was a silver ring, not a diamond. Not flashy, a simple band with a tiny carved wave cresting across the metal. "You said you don't like big gestures that don't mean anything, so I made something that does." She looked up at him, eyes burning. "You designed this." "Had it made by the same guy who did my mother's ring." "He owed me a favor." She ran her thumb over the wave. "This is not what I expected." "Neither were you," he said softly, "but you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm not a trust fund bride, Wes. I don't want that, I want you. The woman who builds kingdoms out of sand and doesn't flinch when the tide comes in." Around them, the party restarted. Music swelled, voices rose, but they were in their own world. "Say yes," he said. "Not to forever, just to now. Just to us." She closed the box and slipped her fingers through his. "Yes." He kissed her in the middle of the ballroom. No fireworks, no applause, just the quiet certainty of two people who found something real in a world full of illusion. Later that night, they lay on the beach beneath the same sky where everything began, the fire crackling beside them. Tessa traced the wave etched into her ring. "You know, this doesn't mean you're off the hook for sandcastle duty," he laughed. "I'll bring a shovel next time. No, just your hands. And maybe some cider." He wrapped his arm around her. "Deal." And as the tide rolled in, quiet and steady, they stayed exactly where they were, two people who'd stopped running, finally brave enough to stand still together. The gallery smelled like fresh plaster and ambition. Tessa stood near the far wall, adjusting the placement of a canvas with a level of focus usually reserved for heart surgery. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stepped back and studied the positioning. It was her first solo exhibit, no commissions, no clients, no filters. Every piece on the wall had been pulled from the raw marrow of her last few months, and now they were exposed under perfect lighting, waiting for strangers to decide what they were worth. Wesley approached silently from behind, careful not to distract her. He wore a light gray suit, no tie, and his hair was still damp from the rain that had started an hour earlier. He held a small paper bag folded neatly at the top. "Your name's on the door," he said softly. She turned, her nerves visible in the tightness around her eyes. "It's weird, right?" "No." "It's overdue." He handed her the bag. She opened it to find a single warm croissant from her favorite bakery across town, the one that closed early unless you were very charming or very rich. "I bribed them with a mural," he said. "Told them you'd paint a baguette on their ceiling." She broke the pastry in half, handed him a piece, and leaned against the wall beside him. "There's a guy here from the Chronicle. He's already asked me twice if any of the pieces are about loss. I think he wants something tragic to write about." Wesley took a bite and chewed thoughtfully. "Tell him they're about finding your way back to yourself." She tilted her head. "You always know the right thing to say." "I don't. But I know what's true." The doors opened precisely at 6, and the space filled slowly but steadily with guests. Some were locals who'd seen her murals. Others were collectors who'd heard whispers about the girl with stormlight in her brushstrokes. And a few, she knew, were only here because of Wesley, their presence, a quiet nod to the circles he used to move in effortlessly. He stayed close without hovering, letting her navigate the room on her own. She answered questions, accepted compliments, and even laughed when someone mispronounced her name 3 times in a row. But every few minutes her eyes found him, and every time he was already looking. Later, as the crowd thinned and the gallery lights dimmed slightly, she found him near the back wall, staring at the painting she hadn't titled. It was the only one she hadn't explained to anyone, not because she didn't know what it meant, but because she didn't want to hear it interpreted. Wesley didn't speak. He simply stared at the rush of indigo, the layered waves of gold, the small figure standing on a beach with their back turned to the world and their face tilted toward a sky bursting open. "I painted that the night after the gala," she said quietly, "before you called. Before anyone knew what you'd done." "I know," he replied. "It feels like that night." She stepped beside him. "I didn't want to name it. I thought giving it a title would take something away from it." "Then don't." He slid his hand into hers. "Some things are better left undefined. Doesn't make them less real." "I've had offers," she said. "People want to buy it." He turned to her. "Are you going to sell it?" "No." Her voice was firm. "This one stays with me." He kissed her temple gently. "Good." The gallery closed an hour later and they walked home in the soft drizzle, her heels in one hand, his jacket draped over her shoulders. The streets were quiet, the city muted by the weather. Inside her house, candles flickered on the mantel. Sienna had lit them before leaving, a quiet celebration. There was a bottle of wine on the table and a note that read, "In case you forget, this is a big deal. You did it, T." Tessa poured 2 glasses and handed him one. "You still want to keep the beach house?" she asked after a moment. "I bought it last week." She blinked. "Seriously?" "Yeah, told the owner I'd double the asking price if they let me keep the old dock." She laughed. "Why the dock?" "It's where I stood the day I decided I was done pretending." She leaned against the counter, sipping her wine. "You know, I always thought I'd end up with someone who hated storms. Someone who'd want to fix everything every time it broke. And instead you got me. You let things fall. You let me break and didn't try to sweep me up." He set his glass down and crossed the room, cupping her face with both hands. "You never broke. You just changed shape." "I was afraid," she whispered. "I still am. What if we get it wrong? We already got it right. Everything else is just learning how to live in it." She pressed her forehead to his. "I love you," he smiled, not the polished kind he used to wear at fundraisers, but something quieter, real. "I love you more than I ever thought I could love anything outside of a spreadsheet." She laughed and kissed him, slow and certain. They spent the rest of the night curled on the couch, her legs draped over his, the rain tapping against the windows like a lullaby. They didn't talk about what came next because for the first time, they didn't need to. The next morning, they drove to the beach house. It was still half empty, the walls bare, the furniture mismatched. But it didn't matter. They filled it with paint cans and second-hand books, with breakfasts eaten on the floor and arguments about what color to paint the cabinets. They filled it with days spent barefoot and nights spent building fires from driftwood. Tessa started teaching weekend workshops in a small studio down the street, while Wesley launched a nonprofit that funded local artists and environmental restoration along the coast. He wore rolled sleeves and carried a clipboard, and every week he gave away more than he ever used to make in a deal. They didn't get married right away. But one spring evening, 2 years later, he led her down the beach to a small cove where the tide was low and the cliffs glowed gold. There was no crowd, no cameras. Just a ring carved with the same wave as before and a single question. She said yes, not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs. And every morning after, they woke up to the sound of the ocean and the quiet certainty that they had finally, completely, and beautifully come home.